As the principal of the Tallahassee Classical School, we read that one of the reasons that you were forced to resign was that you showed the David of Michelangelo to sixth graders who are 11 years old. And I wanted to, I know that you've been working for 27 years teaching the subjects and before becoming principal. So I wanted to ask you, like, something like this ever happened before, and what exactly happened with the parents?
Right. So just to be clear, like, this was one of the issues that Mr. Bishop, the chairperson, had given, right? So it wasn't the only issue, but it was one of the issues. So as far as like last Monday when we had the meeting, the parents were upset at the meeting, not because of this art lesson at all. They were upset just because of the need to even discuss me being terminated or resigning. It's like they did not understand why. That is still a question that people keep asking. It just doesn't really make a lot of sense the last 9 weeks of school. As far as the lesson itself, there were 3 parents who had been concerned when the teacher had the lesson. It was a wonderful lesson. He's got this beautiful PowerPoint presentation that explains the whole history that leads up to the Renaissance. Why did the Renaissance happen? And then, yes, he shows different famous pictures from the Renaissance. So the parents there were upset. One parent honestly does think it's pornographic. I mean, that's just her point of view. That's the one I think everyone's like, how can anyone possibly think, that? But that was one parent. The other 2 parents were upset because the letter that we sent out last year, just to give parents a heads up, like, hey, when you study Renaissance art, there is artistic nudity. Just want you to be aware. That letter didn't get sent out. And so the 2 parents were upset that they had not been notified, because when their children came home or were talking about the art lesson, one of the students had said that she was uncomfortable in the lesson, and that's when the parent was like, I wish I had known ahead of time. That way I would be more prepared to talk to my child about it.
The rules of the school say that parents have to notify 72 hours in advance on controversial issues, right?
That's the new policy that was put into place after this incident happened.
Okay, so before this, I mean, would something, like, if something was controversial, like teachers or the principal would voluntarily, I guess, talk to parents about this?
So there's actually just a couple. It's the teacher, honestly, the teacher who sends out a letter to notify parents. And the other 2 letters that are sent out are actually in 5th grade. In 5th grade in science, they talk about the life cycles of all different kinds of animals. And so within that, they talk about human reproduction as well. So they send out a letter to parents to let them know that, hey, we're going to be talking to a certain degree, very, just big view on that. But we want to give them a heads up. They also read the book, The Life of Frederick Douglass, which is a pretty intense book, especially for 5th grade. It's really, it can be disturbing to kids just because it's like, just to realize what was happening during that time period in, U.S. history.
It's about slavery, right?
It is about slavery from Frederick Douglass. And so again, it's just to notify parents, like, this is what your child is going to be reading here in class. We want you to be aware of it in case they come home and want to talk to you about it. And that was the same tone of this 6th grade letter, is just, we're just wanting you to know, be aware that, your child might come home talking about it, and this is what we're going to be discussing. But those letters come out from the teachers. How I got involved with this one letter in particular is the art teacher came to talk to me about it ahead of time, just to say, hey, I'm about to teach the lesson. Should I send the letter out? And I'm like, yes, go talk to our director of operations. She's the one who has the ability to send the letter out to all the students. And then that's where the breakdown happened.
Okay, so the letter was not sent, and that is the problem.
That's the problem.
Yes, and this is because your school is not part of the public school system. It's a charter school, and
that's correct.
it's linked to a conservative college somehow, and
It
so
is.
the program is already. I mean, the people who put their children in this school
Some of them.
already, some of them might
Yes.
have, like, while they want their kids to learn Renaissance art and classical arts and all that, at the same time they have a problem with some of the stuff that is in this art.
Not just in art, but topics. So that's the thing. In classical education, a liberal arts education, you're going to be looking at all kinds of things, not just in art, but we're going to look at it in science. You know, they talk about evolution. They're going to talk about what was the one? We had another parent recently upset about global warming. So depending on the topic, you know, different parents will get upset about it. And that's the thing. Like, I have parents upset with me all the time. I talk to them, explain why we're teaching their kids about it, explain kind of what exactly, how in depth did we go on this topic? You know, normally the parents are then fine after we talk to them. This one this year, for whatever reason, just got really, wow. That hadn't happened before. Like, we taught the same thing last year, no problem.
Right. So, I mean, you have been doing this for 27 years, but so you've had instances where you had to discuss things with parents, but never
Yes.
to this degree, never to this
That's right.
extent.
Yes, that's right.
So it never happened before that with the David of Michelangelo. It never happened before.
So I did have at a different school. So I taught at another classical school, and I did have, once again, in third grade, they were studying the Renaissance. And so they looked at these exact same pieces of art. And we had one parent there who got upset that her child saw artistic nudity, and she did want her child to be removed from that art class. But that was the first time when that.
Yeah, sorry, but third grade is much younger, right?
Third grade is much younger, but that's what I'm saying. There's nothing inappropriate, right, about any of these pieces from Renaissance art. And so the art teachers, you know, they talk about it, and why are these things, you know, there is nothing inappropriate about it. This is to, especially like she was talking about, we're looking at the David, and it's like showing there's a vulnerability in that nakedness, right? And you look at his face, he was a young, you know, teenager, you know, so it's like you have to look at all of him to get the whole picture of what the artist is trying to convey. You know, she's like, they also study, both of these art teachers, they study the creation of Adam. It's like, well, if you put clothes on Adam, you know, or try to cover him up, that actually is inaccurately depicting the story. I mean, when God created Adam, he was naked. He didn't have clothes on. So if you put clothes on him, now the story is not the same anymore. Yeah. And it automatically puts a shame on him that wasn't there. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and part of this, you know, I don't know if you've read what the director of the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence said. Mm-hmm. But she, while, you know, inviting the parents and the students to visit, you know, to visit them and to see the actual statue, the actual work of art, she said that this is also like a misunderstanding of what pornographic means, and not understanding the Bible, not understanding Western culture, not understanding Renaissance art. And somebody else said, you know, there is some sort of moral crusade against the body, against sexuality, against gender expression. And I wanted to ask you what you think of this. I mean, if this is something of a climate that is happening, I mean, and in this context, the history of art, what is happening to the understanding of it, and the Bible too, in a way.
Yeah. I think that's also a little bit like, typically it pains me that this is coming from a classical school, because this is actually the opposite of what we are all about. Like, we're about pursuing the good, the true, and the beautiful. It's a Western civilization, liberal education, right? So we want students to be able to look at pieces, assess them, critically think through it, and understand, correct, this is not pornographic in any sense of that word, you know? And so I would say, I don't know if it's in the world around, but in America, you know, we do have an over-sexualized society. And so that's how the lens through so much is looking through. And it's like, that's not just the body in and of itself. It doesn't have to be sexualized, you know. We need to teach our students to be able to understand that, you know, they do not actually need to see pornography at all, ever, in my, like, ever, you know. But it's like, but that doesn't mean that your body, that there's something wrong with it, or that you in some way need to feel shame of it. And not everything that you see, if you see a nude, it's not necessarily pornographic, and they need to be able to know the difference there.
Yeah,
that's what we're trying to teach our students.
Yeah, I mean, and you said that this year something happened. Is it the political context? I know that in your letter you said, I don't want to be political, I don't want to be, but I mean, there is clearly a bigger political issue that is, you know, using education, right? Education as the center of it.
There is that push for sure. I really think part of it right now, it has to do also with school choice. And Tallahassee Classical was a school of choice. I am a big advocate for that, because that is all about parent voice, and parents should have a voice. And I do think parents should be able to choose, what kind of school do you want your kid to go to? Traditional, private school, homeschool, charter school. I mean, there's a lot of options now. And I like that. I think parents should have that option. The issue becomes is, what is that line of how much voice do parents, or should parents have in their children's education? Because what we saw here is we had a small group of parents who had concern over curriculum, and it got the ear of the board chair, and now it's become this huge issue. You know, the majority of the parents in that class, they had no problem with it. They want their kids to see these pictures, you know. So it's finding that fine line of when, you know, when do we need to listen and hear parent voice, and when do they not? You know, it's just like the meeting itself, right? I was a big advocate of parents should be at the meeting. Parents should have their voice. You know, when we're looking at me needing to maybe resign or be terminated, parents should have a say in that. But parents don't necessarily need to have a voice when we're talking about the age that their student is going to look at something, or what is the exact curriculum. That's where it's like, okay, if you're looking at a school, our curriculum is online. So they could see, oh, my kid's going to learn about Renaissance art, you know, a little deep dive if they don't know what that is, and figure out, oh, that includes artistic nudity. Like, and then they can decide, do I want my kid to go to the school or not? Because there's a lot of schools here in Florida, and I think nationwide, they don't study this until high school, you know. So that to me is where parent choice gets to come in.
There's also this perception of what you as a person who is showing this type of art will be, like an extreme, like leftist, liberal. And maybe this is not what is happening. So I wanted to ask you about that.
That it is very curious. And that's what I realized last week, that the different news agencies that were reaching out to me, different people, they were what would be considered more liberal and on the left-hand side. And I'm like, okay, that isn't really me. Politically, I tend to be pretty moderate, right? I am, though, a very conservative Christian person. Like you said, in Italy itself, like you guys, you're Catholic, and yet you have these pieces of art. There is no conflict. And that's how I see it, right? If something is good, true, and beautiful, there's nothing wrong with that. So it doesn't go against my moral Christian beliefs in any way. And that is what is so curious right now in this environment. I have lots, you know, when I did attend church yesterday, and I had lots of people, they're totally like, my kids have seen this. We go to the museums all the time. And I know these people to be very staunch Republican, conservative people. So it's not, I don't feel like it shouldn't be political.
Yeah. And another thing about Italy, because, you know, you've been invited, the mayor of Florence said he would like to invite you and to honor you. And, you know, in addition to this, there was this idea of bringing the parents and the students to Italy. I mean, do you think that would be actually everything, you know, considered actually something positive that could open somebody's eyes? I read that Mr. Bishop said something, you know, he said, I have a classical background and I don't think this is pornographic, but I can't change people's minds. I'm not going to change this parents mind if I talk to them. So it's like this idea that, okay, parents' choice, you can't change their mind. But shouldn't education be part of this with students, but also in a way with their parents through the students?
And yes, and that actually is a lot. Again, at the other classical school that I worked with, we did a lot to try to educate parents about what is a classical education, because they don't necessarily know. They weren't raised that way. So it does need to be training the parents right along with the students. And so I think it would be wonderful to be able to go and have everyone come to Florence, Italy, and let's go see, you know, the beautiful museums, not only the David, but there's so many beautiful pieces of art there. I would love it. In fact, one of the things I had talked about and wanted is when we're adding a class at a time for high school. So I said, after we get to 12th grade, I would love to be able to take those high school students abroad and have them go to Italy. We study history through time. What better place than to start in Rome and then go on up to Florence, right? So I would absolutely love parents, kids, anyone.
Yeah.
Go visit. I'd love to go visit. Absolutely.
Yeah. One last thing.
Sure.
You know, this story has been sensationalized for sure, right?
Yes.
And it's become like, so it's very hard to understand, I think, from an Italian perspective, what American school is like now, what parents actually want, whether it's gone completely crazy, whether, you know, there is kind of a fight between the North, where transgender students, as you know, the right sometimes says it, get their teachers to support them in choices without their parents knowing. Well, you know, in places like Florida, schools are having to ban books because they talk about gender and race. I mean, what is the reality in general, talking more in general about the American school, not just your case?
So I think what happened was the pandemic in 2020, all the kids had to go home and start learning from home. And parents started seeing what kind of education their children were receiving. And they had assumed, I think, up until that point, oh, they're getting educated just like I was. And so when they went home and they saw, well, wait a minute, this is really different. This is really different than how I learned. It caused parents to call into question everything about the educational system. So then we come out of it, and then, you know, some people liked working from home, having their kids at home. And so it really just opened up this whole, like, oh, we want choices and how we want our kids to learn and what are they learning. And then right along it, you've got this whole societal cultural thing going on with all these different, you know, topics. And so some parents want this kind of education. Some parents don't want this kind of education. You know, just there's so much choice out there now that it's almost, I hate to say it, but there's almost too much choice. You know, it's like, I want choice, but there's so much choice now, and it's just making a lot of upheaval.
And on top of this, there's a constant political cycle, campaign cycle.
Absolutely.
That probably uses these topics that are legitimate topics of debate in order to fight and impose yourself as the candidate who's really fighting for the values.
Yes. And that's honestly been a little bit of my concern with all of this, is I'm like, oh my goodness, I do not want to become some pawn for either political side, right? Like I'm saying, I want school choice. I want kids to see the David. I don't want this, but I do know, like, there are certain things in books right now that I wouldn't want kids to see. So I want to be really careful about, parents should have a voice, but I don't want them getting involved too much. But then, we need to be concerned. I mean, it's finding that balance. And that's where we are. I think right now that's where Florida is. We're trying to find that balance in a very volatile political arena at the moment.